the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Whoa, tune in every Wednesday, feel the vibe. For the stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and progress we'll uncover. With every discussion, let's support one another. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Don't dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, plans in our hands, progress where every voice stands. In the progress, from the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Strong and keen. Tune in every Wednesday, feel the gravity. Stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and progress. Diversity and discussion, let's support one another. In the heart of our nation, where voices collide, we're breaking down the policies with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Whoa, tune in every Wednesday, feel the vibe. For the stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and progress we'll uncover. With every discussion, let's support one another. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. Don't dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, In the heart of our nation, where voices collide, we're breaking down the policies with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands, exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene, together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie, examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way.
Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Agenda. It is the 5th of March, 2025. Welcome to Behind the Agenda with me, your host, Cordell Jones. And as always, we're here to cut through the noise and bring you clear fact-based discussions on policy shaping our nation. Tonight, we continue from last week's deep dive, unpacking critical developments that impact governance, transparency, and national progress. First on our agenda, an opposition-aligned representative has filed a court case against the government regarding the use of the Natural Resources Fund funds. What's the real objective behind this legal challenge? Is it about safeguarding public funds, or is it another political maneuver? We'll break down the case and what's at stake. Then we turn our attention to the NRF rules, withdrawal rules. There has been a lot of debate over the amendments. Some claim they allow for reckless spending, while others say they ensure efficient use of our oil wealth. Tonight, we separate the fact from fiction and explain what these changes really mean for the people of Guyana. And in the latest twist on oil and gas, the Organization for Global Governance and Natural Resources has written to the Minister of Natural Resources, demanding public confirmation on whether ExxonMobil and its partners have paid their taxes. Are these concerns justified? What does the law actually say? We'll examine the facts behind this request and what it means for Guyana's energy sector. Finally, we turn to the controversy surrounding Nazir Mohammed and his claims that the government is misrepresenting U.S. imposed sanctions. He argues that being sanctioned by the United States does not necessarily mean that the government of Guyana is barred from engaging with him. But is this really the case? We'll break down how sanctions work, what they really mean in practice, and whether the government is acting within the legal framework. It's a lot to unpack on tonight's show, with critical issues that affect governance, the economy, and transparency. So join me in welcoming on screen our commentator, economic analyst, Joel Bagwedin. Joel, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here with us yet again this evening.
Thank you, Cordell. Good evening. Good evening to the viewers. It's always
Right.
a pleasure being here.
So we know time usually catches up with us, so let's jump right in. An opposition-aligned representative has filed a case against the government regarding the use of the NRF funds. Enlighten us on what he's seeking to achieve here.
So thank you again. So like I said last week, picking up from where we left off last week, I was actually contemplating just before he made that application in the court. I was actually contemplating and I was already speaking to an attorney to approach the court in my name for an interpretation of the act, not a court order to sue the government, just for an interpretation, which is something that you can go to the court for.
Right.
So I already had that in motion, and then he filed that case, taking a different to achieve the same objective, but using a different approach, and seeking a court order more or less to for the government to put certain things in place, which he has a different interpretation and a different view altogether.
Right.
So the origin of that matter, that whole argument, which emanated from that individual, was in relation to the withdrawal from the NRF and whether what constitutes national development
Mm.
priorities. So they were asking for some more specific things, and they're suggesting that the act is not strictly complied with based on their interpretation of the provision in the act.
Right.
And you would recall I made some arguments. I've written extensively on it. The Vice President, as well as the Minister of Finance, Dr. Ashley Singh, all three of us dealt with the issue extensively. So let's go back. Let's take a step back and understand a couple of things.
Mm.
Now, the board, the Natural Resources Fund, or the Natural Resource Fund rather, has a board of directors, and it has this investment committee. Now, this individual, the opposition representative, is a member of the investment committee. Now, when the government passes their budget, they have to write to the board, and the board, in relation to the withdrawal, a documentation is prepared and submitted to the board of directors in relation to the withdrawal from the fund. And he was disputing the contents of that withdrawal instrument
Mm.
that is submitted to the board of directors from the Minister of Finance in respect of the withdrawals from the fund. And he's contending that the instrument states withdrawal to finance national development priorities, and it doesn't specify what those priorities. So that's the first contention.
Right.
Now, having established the first contention, we have demonstrated that there is a process, there's a procedure, and that is just one aspect of the procedure. The other aspects of the procedure, the complete procedure, include as well the preparation of the budget, the approval process of the budget, where a national budget is prepared, presented to the National Assembly, debated upon in the National Assembly by all the members, opposition and government side, and then it is approved by the National Assembly by way of an appropriation act
Right.
after the budget, and then you have to go through estimates. So the contention about national development priorities, whether that is vague or not, it is not true. Everybody knows what are the a school child know what are the national development priorities because it is well articulated in the national budgets,
Right.
and you have all the programs in the national budgets for that. So, in my view, in my considered view, that is a non-issue. That is a non-issue. The argument that national development priorities are not defined in accordance with the NRF Act has no merit or basis. Using that argument with the first of all, the national budget, and of course the policy position of the government, which we all know, which is well articulated in their manifesto, etc. They state that they
Right.
were elected based on what they presented as national development priorities in their manifesto, and they're doing exactly that. So it's a non-contentious issue, but they're making it out to be an issue of lack of transparency and accountability. So that is not the case in my considered professional view. Now, the second thing that I want to draw the public's attention to is the jurisdiction of the investment committee.
Mm.
The investment committee has no jurisdiction in relation to the withdrawal from the NRF fund. The investment committee's role is defined in the Natural Resource Fund Act. And their mandate is to advise the board of directors in relation to the investment of the remaining balance in the fund, net of withdrawals. So after your withdrawals, whatever balance remain in the fund, that is what they have to now advise the board in what instruments or which markets or whatever the case may be,
Mm.
how best to invest that remaining balance.
Go ahead.
the other issue that I want to highlight is the jurisdiction of the investment committee. The investment committee's role is defined in the Natural Resource Fund Act, and that is strictly and exclusively in relation to investment of the remainder of the fund, net of withdrawal. That is their jurisdiction. And the Act also, the Natural Resource Fund Act, also defines the parameter of how the monies are to be invested, how the fund is to be invested, what type of instrument, the the risk appetite more or less of the fund. And the investment parameter that's defined in the act is one of a passive investment stance,
Mm.
not an aggressive investment. And if you had an aggressive, if we were to adopt an aggressive investment agenda or an aggressive investment mandate of our NRF fund, we'll be exposing that to greater risk. It means you'd be taking on riskier investments.
Mm.
And we are not in a position at this stage in our development and given our financial status as well, we are not in a position to take on an aggressive investment mandate like Norway.
Right.
Norway is an advanced country. When they discovered oil, they established their sovereign wealth fund 20 years later. And even at that point, Norway was already an advanced country, an advanced economy. And so they can afford in 2025, they can afford to have an aggressive, you know, taking on riskier investment portfolios. We are not in that position. So right now we are investing in safe instruments, safe investment instruments such as financial instruments such as US Treasury bills, for example. Those are safe investments,
Right.
right? And we're getting a decent return on those investments. Now, with that in mind, I want to also explain something because there is a view as well, and which is partly the reason why they're making an issue of this NRF fund, particularly with regard to investment of the fund balance, the remaining resources. And the view is that there is no work for the investment committee, and that is because they want to invest the fund in more riskier instruments, expose the fund to riskier investments. And I just now established the point that
Mm.
we're not in a position to do that. But I want to explain something. You recall we spoke in a previous episode, we spoke about the bond in Suriname, right? We spoke
Right.
about that bond. And I delve into the risks associated with that bond. So in theory, it looks good, it sounds good, but you have to understand the risks associated with that bond. Now, if we are to take a more aggressive investment, adopt a more aggressive investment mandate for our sovereign wealth fund,
Right.
vis-a-vis the NRF, it means you'd be investing in things like corporate bonds, commercial papers, and both sovereign financing sovereign debt for other countries as well as private sector debt in other countries. That would mean essentially what you're doing, you're financing other countries' development, other
Right.
countries' priorities. When you finance, take for instance, the fund is currently invested in US Treasury bills. Now, US Treasury bills is essentially US government debt. A Treasury bill is a debt instrument, a short-term debt financing instrument that is issued to raise funding to finance the US government spending. So our money is financing the US government, practically speaking.
Right.
So how much do we want to finance US government spending or the US private sector? And we have a deficit in our market, in our economy.
Right.
Now, that is essentially what it is. You're essentially, if we devote a higher proportion of the fund to invest in other markets and a lesser proportion of the fund to finance our own national budget, that is essentially what you're doing. You're
Right.
financing other governments. So, does that make any sense to you? When we have so many
To do
needs and
here.
so many deficits, right?
Mm.
So, I'm making it simple for people to understand when you hear these opposition elements, when they talk and they try to sound sophisticated, and the way they articulate themselves, one may believe, or one may tend to think, oh, we're not managing this fund properly, and what are we doing with the money? And why are we not investing the money? But you have to understand what investment of the fund means.
Right.
Investment of the fund means you are financing another country's government. You understand?
Yeah.
So it's nonsense. I mean, you explain this to a 6-year-old kid. The child will tell you that's nonsense. We have to finance our own country, our own needs. So the
Yeah.
current posture, the current investment mandate as defined by the Act is when the Act was created, when the Act was uh, developed, it was developed with our own unique needs and our own unique factors, country specific factors and needs in mind,
Right.
right? So we have to understand that. So I've dealt with the origin of the issue. I've dealt with the contention about not what constitutes national development priority, whether the national development priorities are defined, where is it defined, is it done in a transparent manner? The entire country, a child knows what are the development priorities. It's public, it's in the national budget speech, it's in the party's manifesto, it is in the low carbon development strategy, the expanded 2030 low carbon development strategy. It is in this sector specific policy documents, and all these things are publicly available documents. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they did recently a voluntary assessment of where we are in terms of moving in that direction in terms of implementing policies and programs aligned to the development goals of the United Nations, and they've done an assessment. We are over 60% there, and there are a lot of independent, publicly available document documentations where one can find what is our national development priorities.
Right.
There's no question about that. There's
Right.
nothing lacking transparency in that regard. So I'll stop there in relation to
No, since
that
since we
issue.
we talking about NRF, talk to us a little bit about the amendment to the withdrawal rule for the NRF fund. Give us some more clarity on that.
Right. So the so the withdrawal formula was amended pursuant to the Fiscal Enactments Amendment Act number 2 of 2024.
Mm.
And the formula was amended from the old formula had 100% on the first 500 million, 75% on the second 500 million, 50% on the third 500 million, 25% on the fourth 500 million, 5% on the fifth for 500 million, and 3% on the excess of 3.5 billion. Right? That was the old formula. The new formula is now 100% on the first 1 billion in the fund, 95% on the second 1 billion in the fund, 90% on the third 1 billion in the fund, 85% on the fourth 1 billion in the fund, 50% on the fifth 1 billion in the fund, and 10% in excess of the sixth 1 billion in the fund. This
Okay.
so that's the revised formula. Now the contention of the opposition elements is that this new formula is designed to this amended formula is designed to deplete the resources of the fund. Is that the case? Now, if you do an analysis of it, you would find that it is not, and you have to situate these analyses in the fiscal framework of the country and the development agenda of the country. You can't just look at it in isolation.
Right.
So, in so doing, in situating the revised upward amendment of the NRF withdrawal formula, first of all, let us seek to understand or determine what is the effective withdrawal rate of the fund. And this will help to give us some context. Now, under the old withdrawal rule, the net based on the balance in the fund at a given time,
Mm.
the net, let's say on a balance of $6 billion, 6 billion US dollars,
Right.
based on the old formula, the effective withdrawal rate is 23% of 6 billion.
Okay.
Effective withdrawal is 23%. Now, if we apply the new formula on the same 6 billion balance, the effective withdrawal rate works out to 71.7%. Right? Now, let's use a different balance. Let's take 12 billion. At 12 billion, using the old formula, the effective withdrawal rate is 13% as the old formula on a balance of 12 billion.
Mm.
On a balance of 12 billion using the new formula, the amended formula, the effective withdrawal rate is 40.8%. Now, what does that tell you? If you look at the NRF from its inception in 2021, when the act was amended, when PPP came in office and amended the act, and when the fund was actually operationalized under the PPP, if you look at the balance of the fund from then up to, say, present, up to the fiscal year 2024 or 2025, let's say 24, the effective withdrawal rate is kept below a certain threshold. And we could establish that threshold to be below 80% of the fund. At no time under the old withdrawal rule
Mm.
did we ever withdraw in excess of 75%. It has
Okay.
always been kept under 75 to 80%.
Got
So
you.
when one argues, when opposition elements argue that, oh, we're depleting the fund, you have to quantify what does deplete mean? Deplete means, are you taking out 100% of the money? Are you withdrawing more money that is in the fund and you overdrawing the fund effectively? Running the fund in an overdraft effectively, that is? Or are you withdrawing more than 80%, 90%? What does deplete mean? So we have to define what is the depletion rate.
Mm.
Sorry, we have to define what we mean by depleting the fund, right? Is it 100%? Is it 99%? Is it 80%? Empirically, I've established that under the old withdrawal rule and based on the balance, it has always been kept below 75%. And then if we do another dimension of that analysis, which we've done before, from the inception of the fund to up to the third quarter of 2024, we've only spent 40% of the money that we earned to date, which means 60% of the money was untouched up to that time.
Right.
60%. So with those empirical data factually establish, what really do you mean by depleting the fund? Evidently, that is not the case. Evidently, that is not the case. Now let's come to the justification for the new withdrawal rule. And what is the justification? The justification for amending the withdrawal rule is this. A, GDP is growing. We've moved from a $4 billion GDP to now nearly 30 billion GDP. That's where our economy is today. From 4 billion to 30 billion, right? In just 4 years, less than 5 years. That's 7.5 times.
Right.
GDP has multiplied by 7.5 times in less than 5 years since oil.
Wow.
So that's variable number one. Variable number two, the budget is growing. Budget has grown from a $1 billion budget to a $5 billion budget. And that is because we are spending more, we're investing more money on the capital side to expand and diversify the economy away from oil and gas. And that is important. We have to do that. And so we're expanding our infrastructure sector. We're investing in agriculture, food security, energy, and all the other sectors. We're building out the infrastructure to expand and diversify the economy and create new opportunities, create new sectors, new opportunities for growth and income generating activities,
Right.
sustainable in a sustainable framework. So the expenditure, the growth in capital expenditure in our budget, national budget, is necessary. Is necessary. We're 60 years behind development, and we're 300 years behind. In our own domestic context, we're 60 years behind. We had a 30-year setback. That's our history, to put it in a nutshell. And we're
Right.
300 years behind the developed world. So we have a lot of catching up to do. First of all, we have a 30 years to catch up for in our own. If we look at our situation in isolation from the rest of the world, and expanding that now to looking at our situation in an international context, relatively, we have a 300 years um, gap to catch up with the advanced world. So the expenditure is justified. We have to do it. And we have a
Right.
growing population. We have a growing population, and the population will grow and get bigger and bigger because we have expats coming, people coming home back, our own people coming home back because of the opportunities and what is happening here. So that's variable number two, justification point number two. The third is oil production is projected to increase from 120,000 to just over 600,000 presently to over 1.3 million by 2030, which means the earnings to the NRF, our earnings, the country's earnings in profit oil and royalty, will also grow in relation to the size of growth in production, expanded
Mm.
production. So the size of the fund will grow. The size of the fund will triple and quadruple in over the next 10 years, in line with that expanded output level in oil production. Now, what does that mean in terms of situating that within the fiscal framework? Within the fiscal framework, you look at the financing sources of the budget, the composition of how the budget is funded.
Mm.
It is right now funded from non-oil revenue accounting for 38%, oil revenue accounting for 33%, other sources such as carbon credit accounting for about 3%, and the balance of that is debt financing. So as the fund grows and your expenditure need grows, you also want to keep your fiscal framework sustainable. You want to keep your debt financing low to moderate. So in reducing your reliance on debt financing, and if your revenue or revenue growing, aren't you going to withdraw more money
Right.
to keep your debt to GDP ratio at a certain level? So you withdraw the money and you keep your debt sustainable at, say, under 30% of GDP. So I've given you three main justifications for that. It is in line with the fiscal framework of the country. It is in line with the growth trajectory of the fiscal framework, in line with the development agenda, economic transformation, right? And it is all within a sustainable financial and fiscally sustainable, fiscally responsible
Mm.
framework. It is necessary. And more importantly, when you do the analysis, although the amended formula has increased based on the projected growth of the fund, the net effective withdrawal rate from the fund remains the same as in the old formula.
Okay.
Remains the same as, meaning under the old formula, the maximum amount that has ever been withdrawn from the fund has always been kept under 80%. Under the new formula, based on the projected growth of the fund, the maximum withdrawal at any given time will be kept under 80% of the fund. So that is what I mean by effective withdrawal rate. It practically remains the same
Mm, mm, mm.
based on the growth of the fund, projected growth.
Right, right.
Do you see
No,
how I analyze it and you give all the different explanation?
yeah.
Ask an opposition person to give you that kind of explanation.
We know better. So let me turn your attention to this letter by the Organization for Global Governance and Natural Resources asking our natural resources minister if taxes for Exxon was paid. Help us to understand, what's going on here.
Now, the the OGGN is made up of a group of retired, vexatious group of people, and they refer to themselves as oil and gas exports. Now,
Hmm.
before I answer the question, let me give you a little bit of history of this group of people. When OGGN was formed in 2017, it is an organization that was formed by this group of people exclusively for the main purpose of being an exclusive advisor on in oil and gas or on oil and gas matters to the
Hmm.
government of Guyana. And that manifested in an unsolicited proposal that was sent to the government of Guyana to be the government's consultant. In other words, they're looking for work. They set up this organization to get work from the government of Guyana, right? And so that did not fly with the government. It never materialized. And the rest is history. That's how OGGN now has evolved into what they have become, a bunch of gripers, right? So I want to give that little bit of background to who these guys are. Now, coming to the issue, their contention about these taxes. So, the 2016 PSC, the 2016 Petroleum Agreement, there's a clause in there that says that the minister will um, pay Exxon taxes from the government share of profit, and the GRA would uh, issue a tax certificate stating that they have paid their tax liability. Now, at the outset, when one reads that provision, not being very familiar with oil and gas fiscal regime at that time, we're
Mm.
talking about 5 years ago, the literal meaning of it is upsetting from the
Yeah.
sound of it. Why should the government pay your tax from our share profit? But as you grow to understand and appreciate the structure of the fiscal regime, and when you understand that essentially what it means, the oil companies are exempted from corporate taxes that all other companies are subject to, which is the 40% or 25%, depending on your classification in accordance with the Companies Act.
Mm.
So they are essentially exempted from that tax. However, they in lieu of paying corporation tax, according to the fiscal regime in the petroleum agreement, they're paying 50% profit and 2% royalty. So we're not getting the tax, but we're getting 50% profit and 2% royalty. Now, the tax certificate that the GRA issues for them, really, when one examine the financial statements filed by the oil companies in Guyana, and you examine the financial statements, it is the profit oil that they pay to Guyana that is reported on their financial statement as the taxes that they pay to the government of Guyana.
Okay.
Right? It is as simple as that. The profit oil and your financial statement has to be prepared in accordance with the IFRS standard, International Financial Reporting Standard, which is what we have adopted in our country. There are two standards, GAAP and IFRS. GAAP is specific to the US.
Mm.
The rest of countries they use IFRS. So I'm not aware of any other country other than the US that uses GAAP. So that's how your financial for reporting purposes, your financial statement has to be prepared in accordance with those convention. So under that convention, you have to report your taxes. So effectively, the profit oil paid to Guyana is correctly treated as the effective taxes paid by the oil companies to the government of Ghana. So
Mm.
it's not a case where the government taking out money from their profit share. It is just a matter of treating that profit as the tax. And if you are to apply it, if you understand financial statement analysis and so on, the application of the 50% profit is the same as how you would apply your corporation tax. So if so what I mean by that, if we say if we change the term, if we stop calling it 50% profit and we say 50% tax, it's the same thing. Because taxes, corporate tax, is applied on your profit. It is applied on your profit, right? Your
Mm.
operating profit.
Right.
You have gross profit, you have profit before tax, and you have net profit, which is profit after tax. So whatever is your profit before tax, or let's call it your operating profit, if your operating profit is $10 and the tax rate is 50%, then let's say 50% corporate tax, then 50% is applied to the $10. So
Right.
your corporate tax is $5, right? So it's the same thing. The application is the same. If we amend the PSA from profit oil to corporate tax 50%, it's the same amount of money we'll get because it's the same application.
Mm.
And so it is as simple as that. It is as simple as that. The profit oil that the oil companies pay to us, it is that profit oil that is treated as they're paying their taxes to the government of Ghana. And that
Okay.
is what the tax certificate is based on. Simple. No need
Yeah.
to confuse and complicate the issue.
Right. Now, let me bring your attention to one of the hotter topics in Guyana right now. Now, a video surfaced, I think it was yesterday or the day before, with Nazir Mohammed making claims that the government of Guyana is misinterpreting how sanctions work, that the sanctions by the US government does not mean that the government of Guyana can't do business with the Mohammeds or their companies that they had. Can you explain whether this is actually a correct representation of how sanctions work or how sanctions are implemented on persons or organizations?
Yes, I saw that, and I listened to. I saw the video that you referenced from the individual, and I have to say that it is an incorrect representation. It is a misrepresentation of the facts
Mm,
by him, not the government of Guyana. Now, I also saw that he made reference to the Constitution of Guyana, that he's protected under the Constitution of Guyana, that he has rights, and he's correct. He does have rights under the Constitution of Guyana, that he could do business in Guyana. There's nothing stopping him from doing business. But the Constitution assumes legitimately. The Constitution never give anyone the right that you must break our laws and engage in illegalities.
mm,
The Constitution protects your right with the assumption that you're operating legitimately, legally, constitutionally. So that's the first point I want to make with respect to the reference to the Constitution. The second point I want to make with respect to the reference to the Constitution, and I'd like the Constitution of Ghana is a public document, and I'd like to encourage all Guyanese to get hold of that document, our Constitution, and read it and familiarize yourself with it and deduce your own interpretation. You don't have to be an attorney to read and understand. The Constitution is written in English language, and we all speak English and we understand. We have some of us have a basic understanding, intermediate level, advanced level. All that is required is a basic level of understanding of the English language to be able to understand and interpret the Constitution without the aid of an attorney or any legal training. The second point that I want to make in relation to the Constitution of Guyana is that under the Constitution of Guyana, we have included in our Constitution to sign on to a number of international treaties.
mm,
Some of those treaties are in relation to, in particular, a series of United Nations treaties that include anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism laws. And so pursuant to that provision in our constitution that we're obligated as a country to sign on to certain international treaties. And one of it is in relation to anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism. In the early 2000s, we signed on to the anti-money laundering, the United Nations Convention. We signed on to that, which meant that we had to implement anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism laws
mm.
and regulations. So that's the second point. So the same constitution that he refers to that protects him, the constitution assumes that you're operating and conducting yourself
Legally.
legitimately and within the parameters of our laws. And the same constitution provides for us as a country, recognizing that we are an open economy, recognizing that we're interlinked with the rest of the world, and recognizing the importance and value of being a part of the international system and all these different international conventions, that in order to do business with the rest of the world, in order to be able to coexist and be able to move freely and conduct our business and trade and everything else, diplomatic relations, etc., everything else with the rest of the world. We, it is only fair and quite obvious that we have to sign on to certain international conventions and rules
Right.
and laws and treaties, which we have so done as a country, and we have to comply with them. Okay? Now, having said that, let's come to now the specific issue in relation to the sanction. The sanction was issued by the US government, and I'm going to read verbatim a paragraph from the statement published by the US Treasury Department. This is from their website, and this is what it says, and I'm quoting. In addition, in fact, let me read the paragraph just above that to give context to the other paragraph that I want to draw specific attention to. And I quote, as a result of today's action, all property and interests in property of the designated persons described above that are in the United States or in the possession or control of US persons are blocked and must be reported to OFAC. In
Mm.
addition, any entities that are owned directly or indirectly, individually or in the aggregate, 50% or more by one or more blocked persons are also blocked, unless authorized by a general or specific license issued by OFAC or exempt. OFAC's regulations generally prohibit all transactions by US persons or within or transiting the United States that involve any property or interests in property of designated or otherwise blocked persons.
Mm.
Now, this paragraph speaks specifically to US entities. It says, in addition, any entities that are owned directly, right? So this paragraph speaks to US entities. Now listen to the other paragraph that follows that. And I quote, in addition, financial institutions and other persons that engage in certain transactions or activities with the sanctioned entities and individuals may expose themselves to sanctions or be subject to an enforcement action. Shivani, answer this phone for me, please. Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
The prohibitions include, sorry, let me read it back. In addition, financial institutions and other persons that engage in certain transactions or activities with the sanctioned entities and individuals may expose themselves to sanctions or be subject to an enforcement action. The prohibitions include the making of any contribution or provision of funds, goods, or services by, to, or for the benefit of any designated person, or the receipt of any contribution or provision of funds, goods, or services from any such person. Now, you hear what is the part? End of quote. The part that I want to particularly highlight in this paragraph is, in addition, financial institutions and
Mm.
here, other persons here mean individual, an entity, and a government. So the paragraph before that was in relation to US persons and entities. The paragraph that I just read that follows that is in relation to other financial institutions and other persons. Now, in law, persons mean, and any lawyer would tell you this, in law, person mean entity as well, right? An entity, and the government is an entity as well. A government is an entity. An individual is a person. A firm, a company is a person, which is a legal entity.
Mm.
It did not say US. That means any other. Other. That means if the government of Guyana engages in business with a sanctioned entity, that government will be subjecting itself to risk of sanction.
Right.
Another company or individual conducts business with a sanctioned entity outside of the US, any other, that person will be sanctioned. And here how this thing works, right? The way the US laws work and the US sanctions work. If you are doing business with the US, if you are doing business with the US, it will affect you. That's the simple interpretation. So, is the government of Guyana doing business with the US government? The answer is yes, and therefore, the government of Guyana is prohibited. And if it so desires to, notwithstanding that risk, engage in transactions, then it will be subjecting itself to sanctions as well because it does business with the US. Now, if you and me have no relation with the US, we don't do business with the US, and we don't intend to do business with the US, then it will be perfectly fine to do business with a sanctioned entity, and there will be no consequence for us, and that is fine.
Right.
But if you have an entity and you're operating and you're engaged in trade or any other business with the US, you're exporting or you're buying from US companies, any transaction that you're doing with the US, the sanction means that you are prohibited from doing business with another with a sanctioned entity. Otherwise, there will be implications for you. It is as simple as that. So there is something called compliance. Uh, And companies, because of all these different legal risks, legal issues, sanctions, and so forth, companies are practicing exercising caution and
Right.
compliance in their risk assessment. They have to be guided by these sort of things, and so they would have all companies would have to consider the compliance risks involved here in relation to doing business with a sanctioned entity, and that is why the financial institutions had to sever ties because the the Bank of Guyana had to uh, withdraw, terminate rather the cambio license as well as I believe the gold export license because the Bank
Right.
of Guyana is is the central bank of the country and it engages in international transactions on behalf of the state, on behalf of the government of Guyana with
Right.
the United States, and therefore uh, the financial institutions as well have correspondent banking relationship. So as long as there is a relationship, any other entity, as long as there is a relationship, business or otherwise, particularly conducting business with the United States, in the case of the government, it is more complex than just doing business. You're talking about diplomatic relations, bilateral relations, etc., etc. And therefore, because of that, they are prohibited. The government would be implicated if it engages, and that is
Yeah.
how the sanctions work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Look at Venezuela, for example. When the US sanctions any country, take Venezuela for instance, if Venezuela engages in business with any other country that is an ally of the US, that's a problem for the ally. It's a problem with the US because they're now subjecting themselves to risk. And you see how you just have to read and educate yourself.
Yeah.
So this thing, what he put out about the sanction is misrepresented. It's completely inaccurate. And he has in fact done that. He has misrepresented what sanctions are and how the sanctions actually work.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing some clarity on that, Joel, and also touching on the other topics and giving us a better understanding. We're about out of time for today's episode. Thank you for being here with us. We'll see you again next week, Wednesday, Joel, for more, well, I should say, more information from behind the curtains as we, continue to go behind the agenda. That's all the time we have for today. Do join us next week, Wednesday, for another episode. Also, just after this live, you can stay on Livewire TV, where you can catch Behind Wading into the Controversy with James Bond being aired currently. Joel, have a good evening. Viewers, thank you for being here. And until next time, we'll see you for another episode of Behind the Agenda.
The heart of our nation, where voices collide. We're breaking down the policies with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda.